Well, with that, I want to go ahead and introduce our speaker. So Dr. Felipe Aros Vera is coming to us from Chile by way of the Rosalia Polytechnic Institute, where he received his PhD. And he's a specialist in the fields of disaster relief logistics, transportation, and urban logistics. And before joining Ohio University, he worked as a postdoctoral research associate at RPI. And I was just talking to him beforehand here, and we were sharing some stories about soccer and politics in Latin America. I was actually reading your introduction on the website in the School of Engineering that you actually drove subway trains in Santiago.
Yeah, for 2.5 years. Yes.
While you were studying there. So certainly a very interesting background, and we're very excited to have him here speaking about some of his research working with disaster relief in Japan and in post-earthquake Nepal. And so I hope you'll all join me in welcoming our speaker today.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the introduction. Yeah, I drove trains for 2.5 years in the subway in Santiago. It was a very nice part-time job. I had a lot of fun. So this presentation is about international disaster relief logistics, and I'm going to use both terms, disaster relief logistics and also humanitarian logistics, kind of in the same sense. But I wanted to point out that humanitarian logistics includes not only the operations in the aftermath of a disaster, but also long-term crises like the one in Syria, right? But I'm going to use humanitarian logistics and disaster relief logistics in the same way. So before starting my presentation, I wanted to acknowledge some of my colleagues and friends in the field, Jose Holguín Veras, my advisor in the PhD, and he's actually the real expert in this thing. I'm just still learning. And some other colleagues from Iowa State, Illinois, and UC Davis. A little bit of why I study humanitarian logistics. Well, I came in 2010 to do my PhD, and I originally planned to work in transportation systems planning, right? That was mostly buses and trains. Of course, I love trains. But then I came to the US on January 21st, 2010. And then on January 12th, we had the Haiti earthquake. And does anybody know what happened in February 27th, in 2010? I will get a cookie or a smiley face. What happened? Tsunami? Yeah. No, not really. Any other shot? Huh? Earthquake in Chile, right? Yeah, good point. So actually, just a month after I came, there was a big earthquake. I think it's the third in recorded history in magnitude. I was without communication with my family for 24 hours. I couldn't talk to them. And actually, my brother finally sent me a message using Facebook. That was the first time I could know that they were doing fine. But all the communication going into the country was completely collapsed. And of course, they were working in the response. So that's a little bit, and of course, at that point, we started working on the humanitarian logistics aspect and the operations and all that. So that's why I quickly changed my dissertation topic, and I went to disaster relief logistics or humanitarian logistics, right? So this is just a little bit of an outline of this presentation. I'm going to just offer two lessons that we've learned from the fieldwork, and they have some support in the social sciences. It's not something that we discovered, but we kind of confirmed by our work in the field. And then I'm going to talk about two prominent disasters. The first one in Japan, and the second one in the Gorkha earthquake in Nepal. And they have different objectives, right? The first one is, the objective is to illustrate what is the role of the private sector, commercial supply chains. And the second one is mostly that kind of gives me the link to the role of social networks and the cooperative aid networks, or people working in the field, people from the disaster side that actually help in the response. So that's kind of the roadmap in this presentation, right? So the first one, it sounds, and this is very controversial. We normally put a first slide saying, I'm sorry we offend anybody, it's not our intention. But this one is a little bit controversial. Disasters are different from catastrophes. And I know that for some people in the room, if you are without Facebook for a day, that's going to be a catastrophe, right? It's going to be something very bad, right? But in humanitarian logistics, we need to characterize each event, kind of put numbers. And we're to some extent, we're engineers, so we need the numbers. We need to put something on there. And I wanted to illustrate this with a couple pictures, okay? So this is the first one. This is Joplin in Missouri, 50,000 residents. I hope you guys can see the picture relatively well. So this is the picture before a tornado. This is after. What can you see? So this is before, that's after. Can you guys see? There is a path right there. That is the path of the tornado, right? So we have 160 deaths, which is, again, it's a very, very unfortunate event. But we can isolate the disaster, the event. So you can see that the communities above and below the path of the tornado are relatively well, right? So we have supplies. There are things that we can use relatively quickly to access this place and to help survivors. So this is a disaster. That's how we characterize a disaster. I'm going to give some specific points about it. What about this one? So this is Minami Sanriku. This is Minami Sanriku before the tsunami, and this is Minami Sanriku after the tsunami. So, a couple of things that we need to note. The first one is that this is before, this is after. There are just a few places that were not touched by the tsunami. This one right here, and I believe somewhere here, those two places. Everywhere else, there's destruction, there's debris. So this is a major challenge. In addition to that, there are very few entry points. You can see them right there. So there are some highways connecting Minami Sanriku with the exterior. And that gives you a completely different challenge in terms of the logistics. So this is not something new. We just saw this in practice. But actually, Professor Quarentelli, he's been working for a while in disaster research in the University of Delaware and the Disaster Research Center. And he gives us 9 points that we can know, that we can make the difference between these two events. So the first one is the magnitude, right? So we saw in the first picture you can see there's an isolated event, and the second one is widespread damage, right? So that's one thing. The second one is external assistance. In the first case, nearby communities can help. In the second one, they cannot. So now that means that the government or somebody from outside has to come and help, right? That's a very important point. Leadership, local officials, in the case of disasters, they still can perform their tasks. After Haiti, another catastrophe, the chief of the United Nations, the Bishop of Port-au-Prince, and all these people that are leaders in our communities, they were dead. So now, again, you need somebody from outside to undertake the usual work. Functions, of course, supply chains, right? Commercial supply chains, they stop. They stop because they don't know what's happening, right? In the case of Missouri, well, supply chains, they're still working because they have some level of knowledge of the situation. And of course, this is another one, the fifth one, the need of PPP, or public-private partnerships. This is also very important, right? Because as we will see during the presentation, just the government is not, just the government responding to one of these events is not going to be enough for the entire response. So that's another very important point. The second one is that disaster relief logistics is different from commercial logistics. And this is another one controversial because they, particularly in the private sector, they're doing logistics every day, right? They're delivering supplies. They know what they're doing. They know their business. They have, technology, personnel, training. We can go on and on. But the reality is that catastrophes and regular logistics are very different, very, very different. And here are just some points. So in one case, in the first one, the objective of commercial logistics is to minimize cost, right? So we're trying always to minimize cost by meeting all our demand. In the case of humanitarian logistics, and here I'm making the difference between regular humanitarian logistics and post-disaster humanitarian logistics, you're not really concerned about the cost. You just try to give everything you have. You're actually minimizing not only the logistics cost, but also the cost of the people, right? The cost that you impose on people because you're not helping them. So 24 hours without water, that is very important for very serious damage for an infant, for example. So there is a difference in the objective. The second one is the origin of the flow. We know in commercial logistics where the flows are coming from, right? We have warehouses, suppliers, plants, so on and so forth. In the case of humanitarian logistics, well, we have this behavior that we denominate material convergence. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but essentially it is this desire of people to help. How many of you guys have worked in a donation drive? All of you. So what do? You go with your friends, you gather supplies, and then you send them to the disaster site. Well, actually, and that's an entire different presentation, but the main point of material convergence is that some of those supplies are not needed. So we can characterize between high priority, low priority, and non-priority items. And I can go on and on about wedding gowns, sex toys, and a bunch of different things that reach the disaster site. And that's the reality, right? And things that impose stress in the supply chain, impose stress in the response. And then knowledge of demand. Of course, we know to some extent what is demand in a business environment, right? We have some idea. We can estimate demand. In the case of humanitarian logistics, it's dynamic. Demands and the needs of the people change throughout the time, right? At the beginning, you need food and water, and then you need shelter, and then you need medicines, and then, right? So they're very dynamic. Of course, and then we have another different important differences. But that's just to make the point that it's not just about bringing UPS or bringing the Army Corps of Engineers, even though they have great capabilities, but they need to understand the unique characteristics of disasters in order to really be able to deal with this situation, right? So those are just two lessons that we kind of confirm after the fieldwork research that we did. So now I'm going to talk about two prominent disasters. And by the way, feel free to interrupt me at any point if you guys have any question or comment about this, about the presentation. So the first one is the Japan cascading disasters. And why do we say cascading? Why is it cascading disaster? Because in Japan we had three, right? There was an earthquake, tsunami, and what's the third one? Nuclear threat. Nuclear threat. So you have different layers and different systems that were affected by the different disasters. So the earthquake, affected the transportation network. The tsunami, of course, wiped out all supplies and warehouses. And then the nuclear threat, of course, you're not going to go there. Unless you're a hero, literally. You're not going to go to Fukushima Daiichi plant, right? Because there was a nuclear threat. And that's even worse because it was an invisible enemy. It was something there. But, that also affected the response. So the main point of this part of the presentation is to talk about the role of the private sector, right? Cascading disaster, well, earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear crisis, right? Two plants, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant and the Onagawa nuclear plant. So those produce major challenges for disaster relief logistics, right? This is just an overview of the initial actions. You know, Japan is a seismic country. They are very well prepared. I mean, you have a brief timeline here. You know, after 3 minutes, you already had the tsunami warning. You had a preliminary assessment of the information about the earthquake. After 5 minutes, you have all the intensity information, and that will give you a preliminary assessment of the impact of the earthquake, and so on and so forth, right? So it's a highly technical country in this sense, right? This is just a picture of the command center, 1,800 closed circuit televisions and TV. They have cameras all over the country, right? And mostly in bridges, tunnels, and what we denominate critical infrastructure that is critical for the response, right? So the impacts of the tsunami and critical infrastructure, mainly in the ports, the Sendai port, it was protected by 2 breakwaters, but it was back in operation after a week. And I believe after 2 weeks, it was back in operation for regular planes. I'm sorry, for receiving ships, container ships after a couple of weeks. The Sendai airport, it was located 1 kilometer from the coast, and it was actually flooded. So they had some issues with this, and that's another important consideration, right? When we locate our warehouses, hospitals, airports, I mean, ports had to be in the shore, but we need to take into account how vulnerable they become, right? And then, of course, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plants. This is a picture of the Sendai port. Can you guys see, more or less? So these are containers. These are not Legos. These are containers. And those are the cranes. And even though you can see, I mean, the impact of the tsunami waves, this was not that bad because you can move these things, and the cranes were in the same place. In Haiti, cranes were all over the place. And that's a big issue because now you can bring supplies quickly using the ocean. This is a picture of Minami Sanriku. Can you guys see this? This is a tunnel, and this is normally I think it's a railroad, completely wiped out. That's actually Jose pointing out those are the break walls for protecting the city from the tsunami. Of course, they didn't work because this is a catastrophic event. This is major disaster, right? Those are more pictures of the walls that were supposed to help decreasing the impact. This is another important facility. This is the hospital. This is a 4-story building, and that right there, that's the level of the water. I mean, we're talking about massive, massive destruction, right? So what happened in the post-disaster humanitarian logistics in the case of Japan? And this is the important part and why we say that private sector plays an important role. So a team from RPI went to Japan and they interviewed everyone that was willing to talk to them. That was essentially the plan. So they talked to people in the government, disaster responders, international NGOs, so on and so forth, right? So they did have disaster plans, right? They had their institutions and they had disaster plans, but they actually didn't follow them. Why? Because it's a major event, it's huge, right? And after they realized that the plans, that have been designed for a disaster will not work in such environment, right? They did have routinely exercises about evacuation and all that. Actually, there is one date in Japan that they do drills every year. But actually, and this is very concerning because even though they do exercises every year, they didn't take into account humanitarian logistics, bringing supplies. One of the people actually say, well, the government, they were assuming that somebody else would take care of the distribution of relief supplies. Somebody, right? And this is very surprising for a country like Japan. But believe it or not, and actually I'm going to just make a small pause here, because this is very similar to what happened, I think, 3 or 4 years ago. The US did an entire exercise as well. I think they went to Alaska, and it was the same. Everything was fine in terms of the coordination and how the institutions work, but there is no description of how the bringing supplies, how the supply distribution will work. So this is not something new. There were some cooperation agreements with the private sector, particularly in the construction sector. So in the construction, they were really quickly, they were able to clean the streets and be able to recover the accessibility. But in the case of transportation, and then this goes, again, to the same point, it was very general, very general. So there was no clear guidelines on how to perform local distribution. And that's the key, local distribution. Because once you reach the disaster site, you need to go and help people. That's the important thing. And you can talk to any disaster responder, any of them, and they will tell you last mile delivery is probably one of the most challenging tasks in disaster relief logistics. How to reach the actual person, people that are suffering. That's the difficult part. Because bringing trucks or bringing ships and bringing hospitals, it's not easy, but it's doable. But then reaching the people, that's what really is a difficult task, right? And they didn't have enough critical supplies prepositioned, but that's not surprising, right? Because this is a major event, right? This is one in a lifetime event. In the case of the nuclear crisis, well, it also imposed major challenges to the response, right? Of course, volunteers are not going to go to anywhere close to the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant, right? And volunteers are actually very important for the response because they bring the manpower, right? Of course, when they're coordinated with the local agencies and institutions. There was a lot of logistical issues. I mean, some truckers, they just left the trucks. They just left them there because they didn't know what was happening. They didn't know what was happening in Sendai, in Minami Sanriku, and all those cities. They didn't know. So they stopped, the supply chain just stopped. That's the reality. And of course, there was a fourth disaster. That was the earthquake. After the earthquake, the tsunami, and the nuclear threat, there was an economic disaster. There was an economic impact on the country, right? At the beginning, it was pretty bad. No agency was really prepared for an event of this magnitude. The first 6 days, it was very, very limited amount of supplies that came. There was looting, believe it or not. They was not reported in the press because of the cultural background. You know, Japanese culture, and I'm trying to be very respectful here because I'm not an expert in Japanese culture, but as far as I understand, you know, they're very protective of their society, the way they live. So they were not going to put this in the press, but they were looting. When we went there, some people mentioned that. So there was a crisis underway. That's the reality, right? So then the private sector came to the government. They said, well, these three companies, Yamato, Sagawa, and Aeon, they came to the government. They went to the government and said, you know what? You have a big problem in your hands. Even though at the beginning they didn't realize this situation, they didn't kind of understand the dimension of the problem, and they actually did not support these companies. When these food distributors realized this problem, they started doing by themselves. They volunteered for a month. And these guys deserve a medal. These guys, they saved the situation, the humanitarian logistics response, right? So the main difference, and this sounds like very dramatic, but the main difference between the huge problems that we had in Haiti and the situation in Japan, the big difference was these three companies. They had the resources, they were able to deliver critical supplies. They actually felt trapped. Why? Because after a month, they knew that they had to keep going with this situation. It's an ongoing operation. They approached the government, and the government said, go to the prefectures, and the prefectures were destroyed. That's the reality. They didn't have the funds, but they couldn't stop the operation. It was a very sad situation because they keep going, they go bankruptcy. They don't go, they stop their operation, people will suffer. So it was a very critical situation. After a while, they actually received some funds from the government, and they kept working. But essentially, this highlights, the importance of commercial supply chains. The government will not be able to meet those demands. They will not, even with the help, with the international help, which takes some time to coordinate, right? So we need public-private partnerships. We need to have pre-agreements with the companies so we can use those supplies in an efficient way. So some findings and policy recommendations, and this is kind of, these are just some lessons, but essentially, in the case of the response plans, well, the main finding was that they were not suitable for the size of the event, right? And then here comes another question to the problem. So how do you scale the operation? How can you be able to respond to a small disaster, but if it's larger, you just scale up, are able to respond to a larger disaster? Can we do that? That's an open question. In the case of the relief distribution and donations management, well, they took very long to arrive there, right? And we need the connections with the private sector. And then, of course, there's a couple other important findings and policy recommendations regarding training with the private sector, and also the assessment and communication and coordination, which is also very important. But the role of the private sector is key. Let's talk now about the Nepal earthquake. I have my good friend Prakash here from Nepal. One of my collaborators, he's Naveen Kafle. He was key because when we do field work, we don't just show up to the disaster. Man, that's a really bad idea. You don't do that. You're going to become another victim of the disaster. That's the reality. The number one thing that we do before going to a disaster site is to have a local contact. Have somebody who speaks the language, can go around the cultural differences and understands how things work in the country. I mean, before going to Nepal, we say, well, we're going to rent a car and just go in Kathmandu. Have you guys been to Kathmandu? Anybody? You don't drive in Kathmandu. You can't. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's super dangerous. I mean, I saw 3 traffic lights. How many of those were working? None. If you're not from Kathmandu, you don't drive. So those things, before doing field work, you need to understand those cultural differences. When we talk to Naveen and we say, well, we can rent a car and, to go to the village, and he goes like, I don't drive in Kathmandu. Like, you're from there? Yeah, but I've been 3 years outside. I'm not used to drive like that. That's the reality, So if you don't want to become a victim, you need to have a local contact. So this is a little bit of the context of the disaster, what happened in Kathmandu, right? So what happened in Nepal. So Nepal is a beautiful country, beautiful country. I felt super safe. It's unbelievable. I can see why people fall in love with Nepal. It's a very beautiful country. It's in between China and India. And as far as I understand, there's always some conflict because both countries want to have some level of influence in Nepal. And also it's relatively, they have a democracy relatively new, right? They had a civil war between 1996 and 2006. They finally got rid of the king, and now they have this democracy, but the institutions are not really well formed. So it's a very difficult situation to navigate politics in Nepal. You really need to understand cultural background, right? So the epicenter of the disaster, of the earthquake, was in close to Gorka in April 25, 2015. And then there was another aftershock, or another earthquake in close to Dolaka in May 12. A month after the aftershock, we went to Nepal, and we stayed in Kathmandu, and we visited several villages around Kathmandu, and of course we interview people from the government and disaster responders, right? So there's two major road networks connecting Kathmandu with China and India, and there's a single runway airport at the capital, right? And that's going to play a key role, right? Because that's the main entry point. If you want to bring supplies quickly to the country, you need to have a good airport. So that was quite a challenge for the response. And then you have all of the 6 entry points, right, where you cannot actually drive semi-trailers. I have a couple pictures of the highways in Nepal, and the topography, as I say, it's a beautiful country, but the topography imposes huge challenges in order to reach the villages. And there's a lot of landslides. I'm going to show you a couple pictures about this. So these are a couple pictures. As I said, it's a beautiful country. That's one of the highways getting out of Kathmandu. And they're very colorful, the tracks and all that. It's very beautiful. So these are the immediate impacts. I mean, almost 9,000 killed, people dead, 22,000 injured, a lot of displaced population. In general, and there's a typo, okay? Kathmandu was okay, but the problem was in the surrounding areas, right? Kathmandu did relatively well, but the problem was in the outskirts. So how the logistics to reach those villages, that was the big challenge in this case. And of course, this is the most important part. These are the victims. These are the people who we lost in the earthquake, right? These are more pictures. These are from Kathmandu. This is a tent camp that I visited. It was in the center of Kathmandu. And then you have the villages, right? So construction materials and building codes are not the best. And that was a big, big issue. I mean, I don't have pictures of the hospital, but I visited a hospital which essentially was a 2-floor building. And it was horrible to see that for the construction materials, they use concrete in some of the structures, but you can see in some places where they just use mud, for a hospital. That's horrible because of course it's going to collapse, right? So that's a challenge. There was an impact on food, of course. There was a delay in the production, and of course impacts on transportation. And can you see these pictures? These guys, this is extreme transportation systems. These guys were riding the bus on top. I mean, I don't think I can do that. I'm too old for that. But it's part of the culture, right? There was a significant outward flow of people from the capital. So they left the capital to help the villages. And also, there was another phenomenon that people from other countries, they came back to Nepal, right? Because there's a lot of workers that go to nearby countries, right? And they go work there, and they send money back to Nepal. But since they were concerned about their families, they went back to Nepal. There was another big concern about when are these guys going to go back to work, because we need the money, actually. So there was a lot of, kind of interrelated effects when you have an event like this. Of course, impact on transportation. This is the single runway of the airport. You're not supposed to take these pictures, but Jose didn't care about that. And then let's talk a little bit about the response. And then we're going to connect to the last part of the presentation about how social networks can help in the response, right? And I'm borrowing this from Jose. He likes this movie, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. You guys are too young in the room, but have you guys heard of this? Right, there's a Western movie. There was a very ugly guy and all Anyways, so disaster response plans, they actually have a national disaster response framework. And when I interview, I hope the Ministry of Home Affairs is not watching this presentation, because when I went and interviewed this person from a very high level in the Ministry of Home Affairs, I asked him, how is the response going? And he's like, perfect. It's going perfect. And he actually grabbed this document. He's like, everything is here. And he gave it to me. The book with all the disaster response plans. He was very proud of it. When I received the document, of course, I didn't say anything. You know, I'm not dumb. But I was like, I'm sure we're going to find out some things here. Because there was a big disconnection between international non-governmental organizations and what was happening in the country, and the connection between those two institutions. So it was quite interesting to interview that person. Well, they had this framework in which they define, you know, we have regional districts and different levels of organization. And this is how it's going to work. That's the, in paper, that looks great, right? So they actually did some exercises with USAID. And this picture is actually taken from the disaster response plans. You know, this is how it's supposed to work. You know, so they were very well organized in some sense. Well, this didn't work that way. And we're going to see why. There are different things that, you know, in the book are not taken into account, right? So this is in the paper. This is how it's supposed to work. But in practice, you know, when you need to reach affected population in villages, that's a totally different story, right? So some of the things. So first of all, the official response. The good, right? They asked the World Food Program, you know, the largest organization in the world transporting food around the world, to coordinate the logistics cluster. The logistics cluster established, I think, 7 or 8 clusters for wash and sanitation, medication, shelter, so on and so forth. I went to the meetings of those people, you know, to learn how things were working. And I went to a meeting of the World Food Program. And the first thing the guy said was, I don't know what happened, but the person from the government of Nepal is not coming. So everyone in the room, there was not a single person from Nepal. All the organizations that were working in the response, there was not a single person from Nepal. And then I said, well, there is something going on here, right? There is a misconnection. Well, the bad, custom procedures were changed days after the disasters. So I was interviewing one of the international NGOs, and the guy said, well, we've been working in Nepal for 5 years. We know how procedures work and all that. So we brought all the forms to the airport. And we get to the agent, and the guy said, well, what is form 10.5? And he's like, what form 10.5? Well, that's just a new form for bringing supplies from the outside. You can't do that after a disaster. You can't change customs procedures because that imposes a new layer of bureaucracy in the middle. So things like that, you know, produce major problems. A couple of weeks after, they restricted the landing weight in the airport, right? And again, I was interviewing another NGO, and the guy said, well, you know what, we were bringing a big plane from India. But then, again, we went to the agent because we need authorization from both India and Kathmandu, right, to bring the plane. And the guy went there, is like, no, but this thing is overweight. And I don't know where. We've been working here for 5 years. No, it's overweight. So what does that mean? That means that instead of bringing one big plane, you need to bring 2 small planes. And you need to go over, you need to start from scratch. You need to do everything again, right? So what was in the paper, in the disaster response plans, didn't really work as smooth as the good person from the Ministry of Home Affairs shared with me. There was very strict procedures to control the flow of supplies, right? And I can just speculate about different things, but kind of trying to see the good side of this is that you want to control non-priority items from getting into the country. That's perfectly fine. But you need to let in high priority supplies. I talked to a person from the Red Cross, and he was telling me that they spent 3 days in customs trying to bring a mobile hospital. I cannot imagine of something more important for the response than a mobile hospital. And they went through all the customs procedures. And at the end of the procedure, the agent found dry food, which is for the nurses and doctors that are going to be working there. And they said, well, you need to declare this, the dry food. So that backed up everything again. So he spent another 2 days working in customs. Those are the things that you say, well, how do you do that? Why do you do that? Another person, he was very frustrated. He told me, it seems that the government doesn't want us to help the people. That's the reality. That's the reality. There was a lot of political division. As I said, Nepal is a relatively young country, right, in terms of institutions and political environment. So that creates a very, very difficult political environment to navigate and be able to understand the situation. The ugly, well, first of all, they wanted centralized distribution that actually resulted in practical. And they requested to some NGOs to be one-shop point, which essentially means that if you are working, you're specialized in shelter, let's say. So you bring tarpaulins, you bring a different type of shelter. Well, now you need to not only work in shelter, but wash and sanitation, medications, and food distribution. They were like, but I'm not used to do that. So they imposed new challenges on top of the challenge of responding to disaster. Those kind of things created a lot of problems. As I said, there was a very difficult political climate, and I love this picture. I got the newspaper every day in the hotel, and it says what the earthquake has taught us. And if you cannot read it, it says the government needs money, not foreign experts, to deal with post-quake situation. And there was an entire article saying how everyone that is not from Nepal should get out of the country. That's what they want, right? Why is that? Because of political environment. They wanted to have control. They wanted to have control, right? So international relief organizations, they brought amounts of supply. They brought supplies to the country. That was very important. The ones that had local connections, and then I'm going into the importance of social networks, they worked very well. But the ones that did not have a lot of problems responding to disaster, right? The ones that without connections, big problem. The bad, flag planting, which means that I am an NGO. I get to the district of Dolaka, and I put my flag. I'm helping these people. I'm the one helping them. That is horrible from the logistics perspective, because flexibility is one of the things that we want, to be flexible, to be able to respond to different needs. But if you have somebody that is the owner of the response, that creates a lot of logistical issues, right? And the ugly, well, there was overall frustration with the lack of communication with the government, right? And there was changing in policies and so on and so forth. A very difficult situation. And now we're going to talk about the roles of social networks. And this is what we denominate collaborative aid networks, right? So CANs are essentially organization, like I'm gonna mention a couple examples later on, but it's just senior students of political science. You guys got together. You have connections. Your family is in nearby communities, so you can have a better idea of what's happening. So you are able to do a really quickly assessment of the needs. And then you have the connections to bring those places, and you know the environment. So cooperative aid networks are a big, big support, right? They support local markets because they know where to buy things, The bad, of course, they have limited access to supplies, And well, the ugly, just to try to find something that is not, it's not perfect. I mean, their operation cannot be perfect. They were emergent, right? So they emerge, they help, and then they disappear, right? So they gathered, they had their operation, they helped the community, and then they disappear. So that makes them really difficult to study them, you know? You don't know who to contact. But they are very important for the response. Those people are the ones that can give you the information, the piece of information that is missing to help the communities, right? Some salient efforts of CANs. Well, this is Command Youth Stand Up. As I said before, group of volunteers. I sat with these kids. They were all, they were university students. They were in college, and they had this group. It's called Command Youth Stand Up. They're organized by Facebook, and they have like 30,000 members. You know, the origin of the organization was for political reasons, right? But when the disaster happens, they use all those connections, right, to reach out the communities and organize the operation. Those are just some numbers of the immediate help that they have. 31,000 packs of medicinal substances, 26,000 kilograms of dry food. At the peak of their operation, they were sending 38 trucks per day. That's huge. Nobody knew about them, right? And those are these organizations that emerge, help, and then dissolve, right? But they're key because they know how things are working, right? Another important one is Haifa International. They are the development NGO, and they have a very structured procedure to work with communities. So they go to the community. I think they split like in nine sectors, and in each sector you have a leader, community leader, and then you have like a sector leader, and then you have a community leader. So again, they had the connections. So the only thing they did after the earthquake was to expand their operation and go from development to disaster response. And they brought tarpaulins, they brought things that were needed. It was such a success in terms of operation that a couple of international NGOs, when they saw them working, they gave them the money. Because they would say, well, you know, we have only foreigners working with us. It's very difficult to get a local contact. We don't know how to navigate the political environment. So we're just going to support your operation at that level, right? Because they have a very good operation, right? So those are CANs. And just to kind of wrap it up and to give a couple final thoughts, and understanding that these are just observations from fieldwork, right? Things that we discovered when we were there. So of course there's no perfection here. It's just our opinion, right? So these are the different approaches that you can take. Where you can have like a logistical system in which this agency-centric effort. So you concentrate everything, right? That is one approach that you can take, right? You bring supplies, you have a big hub, and that's how it works, right? That's one approach you can take. Then you have another one that is partially integrated efforts that kind of combine both, right? And then you have the collaborative aid networks. And this is the way we illustrate this thing, kind of roughly saying, well, distribution of supplies and humanitarian logistics is essentially like our body, like bringing blood to our body. You need big arteries to bring blood, right? But those are not the end. You need the capillary vessels. To reach, the tip of your finger, you need to have capillary vessels. So big international NGOs, World Food Program, United Nations, they need to have these guys. There is a need to integrate both the big trucks, big ships, but also with the community, with the people who are there, who are living there, and they understand how things work. Flexibility is super important. The government has a role to play. It does. When there is no government and where there's a lot of division inside the institutions, that creates a whole new layer of complications and challenges to the disaster response, the disaster relief operations. And we didn't talk that much about Haiti, but in Haiti, the cans, also play a big role in the response. As in previous disasters, emerging groups, cans, they were completely out of the radar. We didn't know about them, but they did play a big role. There's a need to integrate them into the community, right? So having said that, I wanted to thank you again, and I will be happy to answer any question that you guys have. Yep.
So the changes in the customs in Nepal, were those scheduled to happen before the disaster?
As far as I know, no. I might be wrong, but as far as I know, no NGO was prepared for that.
How is it determined when the relief effort is over or should be concluded?
Well, some people say that it's not over, it's just a transition. So you go from disaster response to recovery, right? And in FEMA, in the United States, they say that they have only recovery, right? So they go directly to recover, the economy and the infrastructure and the communities, all that. It is hard to tell. I mean, Haiti, I didn't know this, but I have a good friend in Doctors Without Borders, and he told me that months later, after the earthquake back in 2010, right, there was a huge outbreak of cholera, which killed, I think, more people than the earthquake. Well, I didn't know that. So that's, again, if you don't do proper disaster response and recovery, that can be a non-ending problem. So I don't have a good answer for that, but that's kind of how institutions try to work it out, having recovery, response, recovery. Search and rescue might be an operation that ends relatively soon. There is good research saying that after 2 weeks, the probability of finding a survivor is very, very low. So you need to take them out because they use resources. Search and rescue teams are very expensive. Yes?
You talked about the flexibility.
Mm-hmm.
To what extent the flexibility is existing, like only in the regulation or also in the supplies and the material needed in the like, are you, as organization, or when you went there, are you restricted with the kind of support or aid you can supply, or and the flexibility only in the regulation and how to deal with the situation, or also you had a flexibility on the requirement of the society?
That's a very good question. Very good question. And I'm just going to give you my opinion on this because I don't think I have a very good answer for that. You need to be flexible in your operation. Many NGOs, for example, arrive to the villages in the case of Nepal, and the army was there, and they were the coordinators of the response, if you want to say in some way, and they assigned them when they were there. So that's one flexibility that you can allow your organization to have. But the one-stop shop, that's a whole different level, because now you're bringing your operation from relief distribution to wash and sanitation. And, well, Save the Children does much better wash and sanitation than your organization, let's say. So that's a flexibility that you can allow, but of course, there's a big downside of that. It's out of the scope of your normal work. You should be doing what you're the best at, right, instead of going and trying to do everything. In some disasters, it just happens. You need to do everything, right? It's just the reality. But ideally, you're able to be flexible in the operation, but then use the best, the most qualified people for each of the tasks. That's my opinion. Yep.
You kind of touched on it with the flexibility and the flag planting, but I'm kind of interested in what the breakdown was between outside organizations, internal governmental organizations, local NGOs. Was it mainly the outside relief? And kind of in that regard, was there any agenda setting where you have a certain organization come in from the outside and say, this is what we do, this is how we're going to do it? You mentioned that with flexibility, I was kind of interested in.
Yeah, that's a very, very important point. So one thing, some NGOs, they were working in Nepal for a while. So they had the connections like HIFER, and they knew the government, they could work with them and all that. Some others, they didn't. Well, it was a big problem to get into the country. Big problem. I mean, very difficult. And then originally, from Kathmandu, they were assigning the districts to specific NGOs. So the ones that were already working, they were assigned, let's say, Save the Children was coordinating the wash and sanitation. And they had like 5 or 6 other NGOs, and they assigned to these VDCs, right? So VDCs stand for? Right, village district communities, right? To each VDC. But when the NGOs arrived there, the military was in control of the situation, and then they reassigned those things. So, do you see what I'm saying? So I interviewed one of the NGOs. He had been working for a while in Nepal, but then they left, and like 2 years before the earthquake. And then when the earthquake happened, they wanted to come back to Nepal and help. They went through all the problems, but finally when they got there, they were assigned to specific VDC. So the first thing you do if you're a logistician, you want to estimate how much cargo you need to bring. So he went to the army and say, well, where am I going to be assigned? And the military said, well, what are you bringing? He's like, no, I'm assessing the situation, and then we're going to bring supplies. And the guy was like, no, you bring supplies, and then we assign it. And this guy, he's a very strong character person, and he's like, well, you're in the military. You know I need to plan. And he got into this argument, and I'm just trying to say that is, one thing is to be flexible, another one is, put layers and layers of difficulty in the response. That was one of the things that we observed a lot in the fieldwork. It was kind of hard to watch that. Yes?
Thanks a lot for the fantastic talk. I think my students have learned a lot from that, so that's really good. And you talked about this national disaster response framework or emergency preparedness and response system in urban planning and all that. It's always good to have kind of 3 actors here. So government should still be very strong here, and international disaster relief organizations that has to be strong. And then here you talked about the social network or locally tailored local networks. That's 3 things. But the thing is that these social networks, so it's a lovely thing to have, it's working very well, but the problem there is that the sustainability of those networks is in one area of the world that works very well, but can it be applied to other parts of the world or other disasters, different kinds of disaster, every single thing would be different from one place to another place, one time to another time, so that's why I'm asking about the sustainability of the cooperative network.
Well, I do believe we can. Actually, I've been approaching the food bank in Southeast Ohio because I do believe they have the expertise and the network in the communities, particularly the most vulnerable ones, in order to help. So I think those are the steps that we need to kind of move forward to. I understand that these are emergent and kind of they disappear after the response, and how do you sustain their operation? Well, that's where the government comes into place, right? So you need to actually create the institution. I mean, one thing is having a group of people working together, and a different one is having, well, you have a group of people, and now we establish leadership and accountability and transparency and things like that, so on and so forth. And I do believe, in every part of the world, anywhere, you're going to find I mean, we're human beings. We like to be together with our, with our people. That's the reality, right? We like to create social connections, and I think that's a natural human behavior. That's my opinion. So we should explore that. We should use those capabilities to be better prepared to respond to disasters. That's kind of the main lesson that I think is the one that we need to learn. Yes.
I have actually two short questions. So I'm kind of still thinking about the official you talked to, the government official. I think it was in Japan, who thought everything was going well, but then it actually wasn't. And I'm thinking about how the research that you do could really inform these kinds of, because what it tells us is that even when you have the best laid plans, once the disaster hits, you have a completely different context, and those plans might not. We're not able to imagine every possible outcome that could be there. How do you communicate back to this? Do you share your results back to them?
Yeah.
In what format do you?
Yeah, there are reports that we send them. Of course, it always depends on the institutions, how willing they are to receive and read those things. But I do believe, humanitarian logistics, at least in the engineering field, is a relatively new discipline. So social science, they've been doing this forever. Professor Quarantelli, I just mentioned in my presentation, he's been doing this from the 60s or 70s. I'm not trying to say his age, but he's been doing this forever. But from the engineering perspective, from trying to analyze the logistical aspect, it's relatively new. And I think it is related to the new urban environment that we have. So before, we were more like rural communities, and to some extent, those rural communities are more resilient because you have your own resources. To some extent, you have your water and stuff, so it's a little bit more resilient. But when you have an urban environment, you are dependent on the electricity that you get, on the water supply that you get, so on and so forth. So that creates a different layer. And going back to your question, I have a slide with policy recommendations. This is what we found. This is what we believe you should implement. Right? That's one of the outcomes of the research, saying it's not only in the paper and say, well, this is the analysis, but these are the things that we think you should implement. You should move forward. You should try to implement.
Because I'm
in
in
general,
development
yes.
work, and we are constantly writing those policy papers.
Right.
The way they are received varies from place to place.
Yeah.
But this is more immediate. So I'm
Right.
wondering if you would have more success than development, which is like 10 years down the
I see.
line. This is what you need to do.
I think it has had an impact. As I said, there are more people that have been working in engineering too, and they are the real experts on this field. But it's being successful in the sense that the government, there's more and more funds to resilient communities, to create social networks and things like that. I think the most obvious one is that I go every January to this conference, the Transportation Research Board Conference. It's a 13,000 people conference, huge. Anything in transportation is there. And just last year, there was a new committee on disaster response and business continuity. And these are all, TRB is from the national academies. So that's coming from the government. And there's a big push, and now in that committee, there are 3 different subcommittees: young professionals, business continuity, and disaster response. And we're actually tackling those specific issues. So I think it has had an effect. So that's kind of the good news. Anything else? Yes?
In one of your policy recommendations after the Japanese was something called public-private partnerships, and I'm just curious what you think. I know in developed countries that would work very well because there's a lot of established infrastructure for public-private partnerships, but what do you think the capabilities in developing countries would be, like football or maybe?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. And it starts as simple as having a list of truckers in the country. That's the simplest one. You can do that. So in Haiti, one of the first news that went out there was like, there is not enough trucks in the country for the response. And it happens that my advisor, Jose, he's from the Dominican Republic, which is their neighbors. And he was like, well, I did some research, 20 years ago. He's also pretty old, but 20 years ago about the trucking industry in Dominican Republic and Haiti. And he was like, there's plenty of trucks. The issue is that foreigners or international NGOs, they don't have the contacts. So it was as simple as just creating a list with the names and telephone numbers of the truckers in the country. And now you have a very simple public-private partnership. Of course, then you need to elaborate more on those things, right? Because in the case of construction, well, they do have established, procedures, how they implement things, how they clean streets and things like that. Of course, you can elaborate more, but there are some simple things, and actually, the simplest, the better sometimes. It's something that you can implement relatively quickly.
No, that's a good idea. It's just kind of like an expansion of the concept of public-private partnership. Because when I think of PPPs, I think of these larger governmental, private sector partnerships rather than just something as simple as having an established list of.
Yeah. So I believe we need both. We need from the simple things and more established relationships, but having the list is better than having nothing, right? Anything else? No? Yeah.
Have you ever encountered any countries with like policy exceptions in their emergency plans, like that might facilitate the flexibility?
Oh no, they do. They do. Yeah, response plans they normally have. They normally relax their customs procedures and things like that. This is unusual.
Well, Nepal was unusual. Is that what you think?
Yeah. Yeah, it's unusual to make it more strict. that's why it was an interesting fighting.
Do you just think it's the age of the country? Or?
I think it's the political environment. I think everyone wanted to have control on this. Actually, I didn't mention, but when I was talking to the Common Youth Stand Up, they were receiving funds from London. They had some connections with London. And they had a partnership with another NGO. So they were receiving the funds through the NGO, and then the funds went to their operation. After, I think, a month of operation, the government solicited that all NGOs' money from outside the country had to go through the government. And they said, the hell with it, we're not going with it. So they split, and they were just using their personal accounts. Things like that, and you say, well, there is something underlying. Yeah?
Do you think there should be a change in the whole disaster preparedness and response mechanism at national level? Because most of the time we have a government monopolized system. I think that's no disaster plan, which government do. And when like big disasters strike, the government is establishing a great response. And they are most of the time heading the process and they are able to take care of themselves.
Well, that's a lot to say, but I do believe we need to improve. I don't think we need to change everything. I do believe we need a strong government because there are some decisions that need to be made. That there are things that these are the rules of the game, and that's important. But it has to be clear. It has to be transparent for all NGOs. And then, as you go down in the operation, from the government to the actual people working on the field, then you need to have more and more flexibility. That's what I believe. I don't think we need to change everything. I mean, we had some experience, and I believe disaster response plans, they have specific structure for a reason, right? And again, the government has a role. And Nepal, I think, is a good example of what happens when there is not a strong government, right? Because you can go and say, we're going to relax customs procedures because we need to bring supplies. There is a negative impact, of course. You're going to bring non-priority items to the country. But maybe that's better than letting nothing get in the country.
What else are you could be more private sector, more
Oh, yeah.
NGOs?
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. No, I agree on that. Yeah, we need to have more. We need to talk more. That's the thing. And the unfortunate situation is that we talk about these things when they already happened. So the whole point of having lessons is to learn and to, instead of waiting for the next tsunami nuclear threat to happen, well, what if we talk now and we try to prepare for that? What institutions are going to come? Who is going to be in charge of the shelter, washing, sanitation, or children? I mean, children are super impacted by disasters. You know? Okay.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I mean, thanking Dr. Vera one more time.
Thank you.